What's up everybody? Happy October. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're kicking off another 31 days of Halloween. For years I've wanted to do a series like this, and a couple years ago I talked my wife into joining me, trying out a 31 days of Halloween series on the channel, and it also happened to be the first time I was posting on horror reviews in years. So we gave it a shot. We set out. I made a whole list on Letterboxd of all the movies that I was going to watch for each day in October. And as you can see in the channel, we did like maybe 3, 4. We did like one that I never even uploaded, and it just became way too much work, especially because I wasn't consistently uploading anyway, so it took me longer to edit. And as you can see with my wife, if you watch the videos before it all, it was a struggle to keep her awake to watch the movie and then to also try to get her opinion on it afterwards. We both had and still have a lot going on in our lives, doing multiple things, and it was way too much. We didn't have the time to finish it. So unfortunately, I had to stop after like 4 videos. Very frustrating, but it's just the way it is. That brings us to this October of 2022, and I'm trying it again. If you're paying attention to the date down below, you can see I'm already behind. It's actually October 9th. And I'm recording backlog videos for the films that I have watched for 31 Days of Halloween. The main reason I'm trying to give it a shot this year again is because I have a little more time on my hands. I still have other things I'm trying to do, but I actually did have surgery on my knee, so I've been off of work and I'm not working all of October, at least not at my job. And I did watch a movie for every single day in October except for one day. So I figured I've watched the films already. I'd already set out to do a 31 Days of Halloween, initially just watching films, and I figured I might as well try to film them and get some videos up. So here we go to kick off day 1 of 31 Days of Halloween. I had ended up watching Hell House LLC III, Lake of Fire. So the reason I kicked off October watching Hell House 3 is because I had just watched the first Hell House a couple days prior, and I ended up actually really enjoying that film a lot. If you haven't seen that, it's pretty creepy for what it is. It's a found footage film, so I put it off for a long time. Finally watched it and I really enjoyed it. So I decided, oh, there's sequels. Let me watch the second one and the third one. So I watched the second one, and while it definitely is not anywhere near the quality of the first one, I enjoyed it enough to continue on with the third one. So let's talk about Hell House LLC III, Lake of Fire. Starting off with the positives, I did think a couple of the actors were pretty good. Gabriel Scheitry, I'm sure I'm butchering that name. He doesn't have a lot to do in the movie, but with what he does have to do, it's sort of important, I guess. And I think he did an okay job. More so, I think the casting was good. He's like a really tall guy. He's fairly large. He looks athletic, and he kind of looks like he could be a millionaire, sort of entrepreneur guy who would do this theater type of production that he put on in some haunted house. Also, Elizabeth Vermelia, again, I'm sure I butchered her name. She's the main interviewer that we're kind of following along. We're sort of following the movie through her eyes for the most part, and I think she's pretty good. She's probably the best actor in this film, I would say. It is a found footage film. Par for the course, you're going to get some bad acting, but I do think that she's pretty good. There's also a third guy who I couldn't figure out his name. I don't think he has a picture on IMDb. He's like the funny comic relief guy, and he does some behind the scenes production, video work stuff, and every time he was on screen, he seemed believable. He was generally the guy who'd be like, hey, this doesn't seem right. Seems kind of weird. Something weird's going on. We should probably figure this out. And they're like, oh, it's okay. And he's like, all right, well, I'll keep an eye on it. Or he'd have some sort of comic relief or some joke. Every time he was on screen, I laughed at him. I liked him. I thought he was good. So Hell House LLC III, Lake of Fire, kicks off a few years after the second film, and we're introduced very similarly to the second film to a new cast of members who are going in and interviewing this guy who is now bought Abaddon Hotel, and he wants to do a theater production that he puts on generally in New York, similar to the first film, but now he wants to do it in the Abaddon, where Hell House used to be. So we are picking up with some new interviewers who are following along with him, sort of building this theater production in the house, and we're watching the production as it goes along. The other thing I did really enjoy about Hell House LLC III is that it capped off the story that we had been following along with the verse 2. I don't think it's a great cap to the story. It definitely has all kinds of issues, all kinds of probably more problems than it actually answers questions, but it did give us an ending. It wasn't just a third chapter in the film that kind of does the same thing again and then doesn't give you any sort of conclusion. It tries to make a trilogy out of it, and it tries to go back to the beginning, explain some of the things that were happening in the beginning, and give you sort of a closure on that story. I do appreciate that they really did try to go for a trilogy. They tried to tie it together and sort of close out the story. On that note, I do enjoy that they try to give this film a sort of positive ending, a positive closure to it. While the first two films have just kind of been explaining how Hell House is just getting deeper and deeper and nothing's ever going to stop it, the third does attempt to give it sort of a positive story end. And I don't think it works entirely, but I do appreciate that about it. Another thing I did enjoy about the storytelling is that they did attempt to also explain why the building was not just torn down or burned down. They sort of touched on it in the second movie a little bit, but not really. In this one, they do attempt to explain that this guy has purchased this building and now they can't do anything with it because he owns it. And they also sort of try to tie in the fact that this guy who bought it has been thinking about buying or has been involved since the beginning of Hell House. So kind of trying to explain why they don't just tear the building down in the first place. Again, it's not great, but I appreciate that they tried. Final positive is, while this movie does focus way more on story than it does the creepiness that the first two had, mostly the first one, but a little bit in the second one, there's some creepiness in this film. In fact, the best scene in the film is just a recycled scene from the first two that they did over and over again from props from the first film. You know, it's cheap, but it's effective. They attempt to build some new sets for this theater for this play they're gonna put on in this theater production. And there's sort of a hallway that they set up. It's different and it's unique, and I liked what they went for. It's like really white and blank, lends itself to some creepiness, but I don't feel like they use it very effectively. It's not nearly on par with the second one, or especially the first one, but there's elements in there I still enjoyed. Now on to the mixed things. How they explained how they gave closure to it doesn't make any sense really at all. They try to explain that this guy who has purchased the Abaddon Hotel and is coming and doing this theater production, without giving anything away, he's the person who's going to really wrap up and close this whole Hell House saga. When you find out what happens, it sort of makes the entire movie pointless, because there was really no need, I don't think, for him to purchase the hotel and do what he did and to be wrapped up in it from the beginning if he was going to close things out the way that they decided to close things out. It just opens up so many plot holes. I liked that they had a new spin on this character instead of the same old purchase it and then, you know, it was wrapped up in the evil, purchase it, wrapped up in the evil. There was a different twist to it that they tried to do. I appreciate that, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense. In addition to that, how they actually end the film. They do try to wrap something up with all of the characters, everyone, and I appreciate that they do that. I just feel like the last note that you go out on is sort of just like a meandering note that's almost more depressing than the alternative. Finally, let's get on to the negatives, and first is the story. Again, I touched on that a little bit, how I like some of it, but I mean, the story is just a mess. It's a disaster. The whole concept of what's happening and the theater production being put on in a house, it doesn't really make sense. Like, they have an interactive theater, but the house clearly lends itself, or the Abaddon Hotel lends itself to a haunted house. It worked for the first one because they walked through it like a maze, but a theater production, even interactive, when you see it happen, the audience is just kind of standing up against the walls and following them along, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. The plot holes are enormous. It's hard to keep track of what's going on. In addition to that, the first one really tried to give us an explanation for how you found the footage that we were watching. And the second one attempted to give explanation for how we found the footage that we were watching, but then it would throw in a bunch of footage that you're like, wait, how did you get that? I don't understand where that came from. And then you have someone come up, be like, oh boy, that footage we found at this place was really disturbing. But it just made less and less sense the second time around, because you'd see characters that should not be there, that if anyone were to see them in this footage, they've been missing for, I don't know, 7-8 years at this point, would be like, whoa, how are they in the hotel? How did they get there? Where are they? You know, why are they standing right behind you? It just became less and less likely that this footage would be found when people are just getting, you know, abducted left and right, and the time that they can spend in the house is shorter and shorter and shorter, but somehow we keep getting the footage. So it falls apart a lot in the second film. But in the third film, it's like they don't even really try to explain anymore how they got the footage. You've got all this footage that was uploaded to Facebook, I guess. They can't get a cell signal to call out, but I guess the house wants them to allow them to upload this footage. All right, I can try to buy that, but then there's like cell phone footage that just was taken that the person disappeared. Well, how'd they get their cell phone? So they're just going in. There's so many clips, so many people. We see so many people disappear that at some point it's like, it must be someone's job to go in and just collect all of these cameras, but never get abducted. It just becomes so unbelievably implausible that even when you suspend your disbelief for a found footage film, it's really hard. It's hard to even keep track of who we're watching or where this is from or why this exists. In addition to that, one of the most infuriating things about this film is that they continually over abuse the ridiculous static colors and noise found footage stuff that they used in the first and second film. First one, they used it sparingly enough that it worked. I felt it worked okay. Second one, they used it more. It became a little more annoying, but it wasn't terrible. And this one, they just, oh my God, they way overused. They're constantly using it to the point where I was watching this movie and my wife was in bed and she was asking me if that noise was coming from the movie, because it was constant like these sound effects that were just so obnoxious, and out of nowhere it'd be like silent and there's just constant sound effects that sound really fake. They're mixed way too loud. On top of that, those sounds are being put with constant flashbacks of footage from the first and second film, cut and spliced into new footage that we're seeing. So they'll show a film and then show you a cut from the film before where someone was in that room again and again and again and again, like 3 or 4 times in the same shot, to the point where I feel like you're watching that longer than you're watching the actual footage that we're supposed to be watching. I can't even be creeped out by it because I can't figure out like what I'm supposed to be watching because there's so many flashbacks. On top of that, they did something in this film with like autofocus that I didn't notice that they used in the first film at all. In this one, it looks like the autofocus is on when people are holding the cameras. So it will continually not focus on their face and then focus and not focus and then focus. Combine that with cuts of that same room that we saw prior and the static effects. In addition to that, freeze frame of like ghosts and characters behind them with autofocus and everything, it's hard to even tell what you're supposed to be watching. You're watching so much. At some point, I feel like I'm watching the older films more than I'm watching this one. And when they show the spooky stuff of like the characters behind them and everything, it's so bright and so vibrant and so in your face. And clearly those actors and all of those characters are back. It's not only not effective and not creepy, but when that character watches that footage back, it's not going to be like, oh, do you see something there? It's like a forum of all of the characters, clear as day. And it's like, why are they there? And why do we need a freeze frame of them so well lit? It just kills all attention. The other really bad thing about this one is the set design in it is so cheap. It lended itself really well to the first film, especially when you figure out what's going on with the story and the financial backing and the things that they have going on. Plus the fact that they're just making a maze in an abandoned hotel. They're sort of don't have a lot to work with. It really makes sense that they would have low budget items or poor set design, even though I think they did a pretty good job in the first film actually. But in this one, everything looks so cheap. And this is supposed to be a New York City theater production put on by a millionaire. And it looks like they went to Home Depot and got like a few lights and things here and there. Walmart got some sheets and like a few mannequins and stuff, and just cleaned up a little bit, and it's really, really cheap. The best looking thing is the set of wine and alcohol that they had from the first two films has been replaced with all new, clean, fresh new bottles of alcohol that the guy who bought the Abaddon Hotel apparently sells. It's his own label. It's like these clean, crisp, brand new bottles of alcohol, and those look really nice and high end. Everything else just looks so cheap, and it's so hard to ignore that it looks so cheap because it's supposed to be a play. It's supposed to be a theater company put on by a millionaire. It really pulls you out of the film, and if you're not getting sucked out by all the effects and all the cuts and all the constant barrage of back and forth and this and that, when you're actually trying to watch what's going on in the story, it's just so hard to believe that this is a real theater company that's putting this on. So ultimately, this is definitely not a great film to end the trilogy on. This film absolutely does not stand on its own. You must watch the two prior films. You'd be so lost trying to keep up with all the flashbacks and story. And so I'm glad I watched it. I really applaud the director for setting out to do this trilogy, because supposedly it had been set out to be a trilogy the entire time, and he stuck with it. He made the trilogy, closed the story. I have to really applaud him for that. And for that reason, I'm really happy I watched all three films. I enjoyed all three of them for the most part, but 3 is definitely the weakest. So thanks anyone who's watching this. If you made it to the end, thanks for checking this out. I really appreciate it. On to day 2 of 31 Days of Halloween.